You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property under laws they had no part in making.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Ansel.
This is episode 395 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. On today's show, I'm talking about a prisoner swap between Russia and Ukraine. I have updates on the peace deal being worked out between the U.S. and the Taliban. And then I'll wrap up the show with some news on the war in Yemen. Please take the time to share the show or recommend it to a friend. The best place to find the show online is at the Libertarian Institute, where the show, along with the daily news roundup that I write, are featured in the right-hand column of the homepage. If you're a new listener to the show, make sure you subscribe to the show somewhere. It's on anywhere you can find podcasts, and then the show is also included on the all podcast feed for the Libertarian Institute, so you can check that out as well. Last, if you want to donate to the show, you do that at patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus. I do a monthly live stream, take questions from listeners. You join me on the show. Either way, $5 a month, patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus. All right, the first thing I have on today's show is to talk about the smackdown Pamela Anderson gave to Meghan McCain on The View about Julian Assange. And so, this isn't the place I guess you would necessarily hope to find discussions about Assange on television with people who actually understand, to some extent what he's doing and why he's doing it and who are good representatives of him. But apparently Pamela Anderson is that. So the clip I watched can be found in this article at Common Dreams that I'll link to in the show notes page. It's like 4 minutes or so. It's definitely worth checking out. But, it opens up with Meghan McCain just going on a rant about how evil Julian Assange is, calling him a cyber terrorist, saying he put lives in danger, and all these other claims. And she pretty much just rolls up, all the negative things that anybody who says about Julian Assange in a couple minutes. And then, Pamela Anderson tries to respond. Now, I think at first she maybe gets, a little bit tied up into little nuances, but then she, has a great response in the end, which is basically that, you're talking about all the things that Wikileaks has done, but look at what the U.S. military does as far as killing civilians and endangering people's lives and making the world, a more dangerous place for people. And really just flips it around and goes on the attack because, Meghan McCain made so many false claims in that short amount of time that I guess she would never had a chance to respond to it all, which is what she was trying to do at first. So I guess to respond to all of them, on my show, because I do have the longer format, Meghan McCain, tries to say that Assange was pooping everywhere, which isn't even a false claim. It's like a parody of a false claim. They said that he wasn't taking good enough care of his cat, which just turned out not to be the case. The cat had a litter box. The place he had remained relatively clean. And also, for anybody judging him, he was locked in this, couple hundred square feet of this embassy for 6 years that, he was able to move around in the last, couple months of that or more was under some pretty unfriendly guard situation. So a very tough position for Assange to be in. And so, if maybe he didn't clean his cat's litter box enough, that's, one thing that you definitely can't fault him for. One of the things they did is they tried to attack him for making bone broth by saying that, this was like some kind of disgusting thing. But a lot of real health nuts I know like this bone broth stuff. So I'm guessing that, it was just a completely untrue smear against Assange. She made attacks against WikiLeaks for, exposing government secrets, which I guess is true. But, that's not really something on its own to be a bad thing. If the government secrets that are being exposed are corruption and war crimes and the kinds of things that WikiLeaks has exposed, well, that's a good thing, not a bad thing. The cyber terrorist claim is obviously just, fear words slammed together to make Assange sound like something that he isn't. In a lot of these cases, he's not actually involved in any way with the retrieving of documents. I guess there's some speculation that in the Chelsea Manning situation, Assange did offer to help Chelsea Manning be able to access the government system in a way that would give her more anonymity to help, avoid being caught. But even that, is a little bit different than Julian Assange just going in and hacking into government servers and like the DoD database itself and, exposing documents that way. And so, it's really not the case. And I guess it's a way to try to claim that Julian Assange isn't a journalist, which is, what he is. They just publish documents and have 100% accuracy track record there as far as publishing real documents, which is, more than most media organizations could say. And just because they don't have an article on all the documents that they print, which has bias written into it. And so in a way, I really like the way that WikiLeaks puts information out, even though in a sense, maybe raw and overwhelming for a lot of people. There's no bias cooked into it. It's just, what was said at what time, what was ordered at what time, and what the results were is a lot of the information that you get in here. Now, the claims of Assange putting people in danger, it's been proven false time and time again. There's a couple of things here. I think one, Meghan McCain tries to point out that maybe CIA agents or just intelligence operations were, the agents were either killed or their operations were exposed because of documents that WikiLeaks has put out. Again, I think this is proven not true. There are some documents that were published by WikiLeaks and other news agencies, not just WikiLeaks, but mainstream ones. I think The Guardian, that did put out the names of people who worked with the U.S. government in Afghanistan. And there are, claims and there's been criticisms of WikiLeaks for publishing this information because, it could have put people in danger. Now, the narrative from WikiLeaks is that it was actually The Guardian that was going to put out the information first. And so then WikiLeaks ended up just putting it out because they thought it was important for the people whose names were on the list to know that their names were going to be exposed. And I guess, didn't want the, whatever the enemy was there at the time in Afghanistan to find out that they were working with the government. So, Pamela Anderson, I guess, could have tried to say all that. And she almost did at first. She tried to start debunking it. But then I think she took a really positive turn, just straight up went on the attack. And she said, look at all the people the American military kills, the war crimes committed overseas. And this is the kind of stuff that Julian Assange is exposing. If she wanted to go further, I guess she'd make it personal for Meghan McCain and say, look, these are all the war crimes that your father's wars, all of his votes and campaigning for it, all the groups he wanted to arm. That's what Julian Assange is exposing. So I guess that you don't like that. It tarnishes the legacy of your father. But the reality is important for the American people to know. I guess, maybe she felt like she had a little too much class to say that or something to Meghan McCain, but did, point out how U.S. foreign policy as a whole is extremely destructive and much more violent and problematic than WikiLeaks and whatever even the false claims against them are. She got a round of applause for this, and Meghan McCain had to go as far as tell the crowd to shut up. She then fielded questions from some of the other hosts. I honestly don't know any of the other hosts' names. So, one of them was about, it being WikiLeaks' fault for getting Donald Trump arrested and how they only put out information against Hillary Clinton. And she doesn't really say, that she knows or not that WikiLeaks had information about Donald Trump, but says that she thinks Assange would have had he gotten that information, and points out that, look, that these emails, the information that WikiLeaks put out was just information saying what Hillary Clinton was doing. That was a bad thing because Hillary Clinton's, she doesn't go on to make this point, but Hillary Clinton's a bad person. And, she's just kind of talking about how the information was made public so the American people could make the most informed decision possible. And, I think she just, in this format, does a great job of answering questions about WikiLeaks. So I was really, excited to see this clip, especially knowing that this is probably an audience that doesn't listen to a whole lot of debates on WikiLeaks or, has ever heard a real representative, a friend of Julian Assange, make an effort to defend him. If you ever even hear the debate on CNN, there's usually no one super friendly to Julian Assange, even if there is somebody that's like, oh, maybe, we shouldn't assassinate him, but you don't really get a full spectrum debate there. So great, I think, exposure to this audience, and did a fantastic job there. And I really do recommend everybody goes and checks out that clip. There is a Ukraine-Russia prisoner swap that involved 35 people being sent each way. Some of the notable transfers were at least some of the sailors involved in the Kerch Strait incident where Russia had denied access to some Ukrainian small naval vessels from crossing from the Black Sea into the Sea of Azov, and it wound up with Russia seizing at least one Ukrainian ship and detaining maybe 24 or so sailors for quite some time now. It's been several months. So I heard that they were involved in this prisoner swap, as well as somebody that the U.S. mainstream media and the Ukrainian government alleges was involved in the shootdown of, I believe the flight was MH370, where a passenger liner was flying over eastern Ukraine and was shot down by an anti-aircraft system. A lot of debate over who was responsible for that. I think a lot of the evidence does point to the Ukrainian rebels, but there's some question marks on that, and so I definitely should do some further reading and maybe have a guest on to talk about that in the future. But anyways, that he's alleged to be involved in that, but I think the evidence of that is pretty thin as far as his involvement. And so that's kind of the fear mongering from the U.S. mainstream media. There is a very good article by Moon of Alabama on some fake news about this whole thing. When you look at the U.S. mainstream media sources, CNN, Reuters, etc., they portrayed as 35 Russians were sent from Ukraine to Russia in this prisoner swap. That actually wasn't the case. Almost all of those people were Ukrainians who were captured somewhere along the lines of the Ukrainian Civil War. And it's just that Eastern Ukraine has the favor of the Russian government that, these people are involved in the prisoner swap. And I guess, if they want to, could then re-enter the rebel-held areas of Eastern Ukraine. Since that civil war is not officially ended, it is still in something of a rocky ceasefire. So, as you would expect, the fear-mongering from the U.S. media against anything about any kind of positive Russian relationship with any other country, somehow it has to be meddling and undermining. But it is important steps in a direction of mending the relationship between Moscow and Kiev, and hopefully finding some more permanent solution to the civil war that's ongoing in Ukraine. In Syria, it looks like at least some of the safe zones have been set up in northern Syria. I'm not sure as to any reporting on how deep they're going into Syrian territory, but this is the area between northeastern Syria and Turkey, all the area east of the Euphrates River that's Kurdish held, and they're backed by the Americans. And Turkey has a real problem with the Kurdish people, those residing in Syria and in Turkey, and wanted to establish a safe zone along the Syrian-Turkish border that went 30 kilometers into Syria at some point. Apparently there was some kind of negotiation with the American and some kind of agreement met, and there's now joint U.S. and Turkish patrols along this border. I guess the Turks probably had to be escorted by the Americans or our Kurdish allies may attack them. So a very interesting situation there with Turkey being a NATO ally. Syria, the Assad government, has condemned the move, saying it's a violation of Syrian sovereignty, and it absolutely is. Something kind of interesting that I want to point out here is that the U.S., and the Hawks would say that we have to stay in Syria to protect the people there from the reemergence of ISIS or from Assad, who's a brutal murderer who just is going to kill everyone. And that's the reason we need to stay. And yet now we've made a deal against our Kurdish allies to support, our geopolitical rivals and NATO partners in Turkey. And so it's always interesting how they want to say it's about the people, but then as soon as, the global interests outweigh the regional ones, then, the regional allies and the people who are actually suffering and fighting, the U.S. wars are left hung out to dry. One indication that I have is that these patrols are actually going on is the Syrian government went out of their way to condemn this move by Turkey and the United States as a violation of Syrian sovereignty, which it seems to me it is. We can't make a deal to establish a safe zone in the country and not even have them included in the discussions here. And of course, it's all propaganda to call this thing a safe zone in the first place. It's kind of just Turkey's mission to be able to better suppress the Kurdish population in both Turkey and Syria, where, definitely the Kurdish population is suppressed by the central government there, kind of a different ethnic group situation, while the, PKK, that is the Turkish Kurds insurgency operation against the Turkish government, and they do use some terrorist tactics, I've been told, but they also take refuge in Syria and are allied with the Syrian YPG that the Americans back. And so what Turkey is trying to do by creating this safe zone is make it easier for them to kind of control what's going on in the Turkish area of Kurdistan and occupy and, really oppress the people. Just want to emphasize that that's what America's helping to have happen here. And it's interesting that we're, having this without any debate at all. And when you talk about withdrawing from Syria entirely and just, telling, the Kurds that, hey, if you want, autonomy or, want to have Turkey interfering in Syrian Kurdistan, you're either going to have to make a deal with Russia, Assad, or, kind of draw the border yourself. But it's not going to be the American forces that are going to hold up for you. Then you're sacrificing the Syrian Kurds and you're, hanging them out to dry and you're the terrible person. When you said the Americans shouldn't have armed them in the first place, and yet here they're hung out to dry and kind of stabbed in the back for geopolitical reasons, and nobody is going to say anything because everybody loves NATO. Turkey announced a plan that they're going to try to settle 1 million Syrian refugees back in the Turkish-held areas of northern Syria. We'll see how that goes. Hopefully, this isn't like some kind of ethnic thing where they're going to try to stick the Sunnis in Kurdish territory in order to try to shift the population balances there. And then, say, oh, now it's elections and look, it's majority Sunni. And so Kurds, you have to live, under Sunni reign and, maybe creating lasting ethnic tensions in northern Syria that way. Turkey is also saying that the European governments have to help out, or they're going to open a corridor allowing Syrian refugees to pour into the rest of Europe. On to news about Afghan peace talks. It doesn't seem like things are headed in a great direction if you're looking for a complete withdrawal of U.S. troops from Afghanistan. We now have some details about a potential agreement that I guess could be signed by the leadership of each side that would include the U.S. withdrawing about 5,000 troops and closing 5 bases within the first 135 days, and then potentially a complete withdrawal of U.S. forces in I believe about 16 months. Now, there's apparently a bunch of conditions that would have to be met for the U.S. to withdraw forces that quickly or at all. And so it could be, I guess, that the U.S. ends up withdrawing, but it takes several years. And I've talked about in the past on the show how my concern there would be the longer the timeline for the withdrawal, the more reason and more events that people will try to use as excuses to have the U.S. stay forever. And we definitely are already starting to see that. I guess Trump canceled what would have been a meeting with some members of the Taliban leadership at Camp David, and maybe this would have even been the event of the deal signing or just really solidifying negotiations or something like that, leadership trying to get intentions of each other. But then that was canceled after a Taliban attack in Kabul that resulted in 1 U.S. soldier dying. And so I had pointed out that, look, the Taliban are going to continue the war, at the very least against the Afghan government, if not against all U.S. forces until those forces end up leaving. And this is more or less what the Taliban have said all along. And so I guess maybe if there is a short timeline and agreed upon withdrawals at events, that might be something that the Taliban buy into, but it doesn't seem like they're going to buy into the Americans dragging their feet at all or simply giving up the fight in the meantime. It seems like the war against the Afghan government will continue to go on. And I'm sure the Afghan government's war against the Taliban will likewise continue. One big reason for the question mark is just it's really hard to tell what Trump is going to do. He does seem to have some instincts that tell him to get out of Afghanistan, and that's good. However, he's been easily flipped by Hawks on these issues in the past, and it seems like anytime he does want to do anything that ends up drawing down any kind of, overseas intervention, he's often easily delayed and thrown off course by the, bigger Hawks in his regime. Now, I was reading in several sources that Bolton, the arch hawk in the Trump administration, was sidelined at a meeting about Afghanistan, and so that could be a good sign that maybe he isn't listening to Bolton on the issue. But there are plenty other people in the room, and my guess is that other than Trump, it's hard to find anybody in the administration who would really want to withdraw all of U.S. forces from Afghanistan. After Trump canceled the meeting, Mike Pompeo put out a statement saying that the U.S. would continue their pressure against the Taliban until, I guess, the peace agreement was met. And, said this includes supporting the Afghan government in their operations against the Taliban. So, as much as I think is starting to be portrayed that this peace deal is in motion and that the Taliban are just continuing to carry out attacks, in spite of that, it's also the fact that the Americans are continuing their war against the Taliban, that this war is going on both sides. There was an attack in Kabul against, kind of international housing compound that a lot of mercenaries stay at. And then there's some great coverage of the attack in The Nation. Now, I'll link to this article in the show notes page. And it has some interesting statements from the people that live around the area. But basically, there's this hotel or housing complex that people who are, acting as mercenaries and contractors on behalf of either, the United States, the NATO coalition, or the Afghan government. So the enemies of the Taliban, use this compound, but it's built right in the middle of a, kind of a suburban, housing area. And so the Taliban see this as a legitimate target, and the Taliban have attacked it several times. Now, I was looking back and realized that the most recent attack was kind of portrayed as the Taliban, attacking not a military target and then in the process harming civilians and, how bad the Taliban are. And in some extent, that's true. They are carrying out attacks in civilian area, and I'm sure they probably find other targets to hit. But at the same time, this is seen as the Taliban as a military facility, and that seems to be how the residents of the area feel as well, that their concern isn't as much that the Taliban are coming into the area, but that this international complex is drawing them into the area, and it's the fact that this is basically a military target that has drawn the Taliban in, and that's the problem. And they want, the international contractors to leave. So I'll link to that in the show notes page, but Taliban attacks continue across Afghanistan. And again, this is the concern I had during the peace talks all along, is that every Taliban attack is going to be used as one excuse or another for the U.S. not to engage in the peace talk process, or once an agreement is reached, to continue to delay or move back their commitments under the agreement. Iran further walked back commitments to the Iran nuclear deal. This is, of course, after the U.S. Unilaterally withdrew from it over a year ago and reimposed oil sanctions on Iran. And so now they're saying that as a part of the agreement, what it says is if the United States or other actors leave and reimpose sanctions against Iran, then, they don't have to live up to the commitments that they were gaining in exchange of those sanctions relief. So that continues to be what happens, and they say that they're opening up their research and development program further. This is, of course, being portrayed by the Hawks as Iran is developing nuclear weapons. That's not the case. The research continues to be on their civilian energy program that every country is allowed to have. The U.S. has also offered Iranian cargo ship captains a large amount of money, I guess, to turn over their ships to the United States. I guess, the U.S. kind of saying that, hey, if you comply with the, laws that we're setting for the rest of the world, and that is that Iran isn't allowed to sell oil to anyone anywhere, then we'll pay you for your compliance. Now, I'm sure a lot of people in the Middle East are much more aware that the U.S. is notorious for stiffing their local contractors, or, treating somebody like the Kurds, who, we bat them when, they help us against ISIS, but then as soon as Turkey wants the U.S. to change their policy, we're going to cave to that. And so I doubt this will amount to anything, but it's just interesting how the U.S. State Department is saying that, we'll bribe an Iranian ship captain to hand over their ship to us. All right, so I'm wrap up with this story about Yemen here. Saudi Arabia and the UAE, who are backing opposite sides in this new war that has broken out in Yemen, have issued a joint statement calling for a ceasefire. This relationship between Saudi Arabia and the UAE is very interesting, and it's led to, I think, a lot of confusion in the Yemen war. And I just want to talk about one way that the media has been covering this story, saying that the UAE is opposing the Saudi government in Yemen because it has Islamist factions, and kind of what it's referring to there is the Al-Islah party in Yemen, which is the Muslim Brotherhood affiliate. And it really portrays the situation as the UAE not backing Islamists in Yemen, which is really far from incorrect, because they do back, people who support Islamic kind of fundamentalist government, and that is the AQAP, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. the Al-Qaeda affiliate there. So, this is really important, that the UAE is not just, trying to support the secularists in Yemen. That's really not the case at all. It just so happens that in this battle, they really oppose the Muslim Brotherhood because it's like a democratic version of an Islamic government, which the UAE being a monarchical Islamic government, is afraid of and opposes. So just, kind of an interesting thing there. And I think that's where I'll wrap up the show for today. Make sure to check it out, thelibertarianinstitute.org. Join the Facebook group, Foreign Policy Focus, and patreon.com/Foreign Policy Focus to donate.